watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side Live. As always, I'm one of your hosts, Yurii Peltier, here alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, welcome.
Eugene, thank you. It's good to be back with you, coming to you from, I'm back in Lebanon, Beirut.
That's true. You are back.
Yeah,
Before
I am
last
back.
week, you were in America and Virginia.
Cuba.
No,
right,
before
yeah.
that, you were in Cuba. It's a lot.
Right, I
It's a
can't keep
whirlwind.
up. I can't keep up. Lots of travel.
We've already seen some of the great content that you've put out from Cuba, and I know that there's a lot more coming, but hats off to you and the whole Breakthrough News team who is down there. So for those who are watching on YouTube, that's a good point. This is a good point, rather, than to remind you to hit the subscribe button, hit the bell so you can get the alerts, because we're putting out all sorts of fantastic things about all different parts of the world, but certainly, especially because we've got a lot more great upcoming stuff from our international trips. And as you can see on the screen below me, you can also go to patreon.com/breakthrough news and become a patron, an ongoing donor. All of your patronage would be greatly appreciated. I think you said, Rania, this has actually already been asked about in the chat. So we are looking out for you, chat participants. We do have a Patreon, and you can go to patreon.com/breakthrough news and become a patron. We would deeply, deeply appreciate that. And of course, if you're watching anywhere, make sure that you go ahead and hit that share button so whoever is following you can follow us. We've got many different things on the show, as we always do. Of course, we'll be continuing to check in on the NATO war drive, if you will, in Eastern Europe. We're going to be talking to voices from Ukraine who are opposed to war, also Germany, same thing. We're going to be talking about the difficult situation that political prisoner Leonard Peltier finds himself in now, currently after having been diagnosed with COVID-19. We're going to be talking to our good friend Ali Abu Nima about Israeli apartheid and some of those who have come into the struggle, if you will, around describing the occupation as a form of apartheid and what all of that means. And of course, we will be talking about the big news this morning, which is the raid, the U.S. raid in Syria that killed the head of ISIS. So all sorts of things for you here on the show. So just make sure that you go ahead and hit that share button wherever you are, so whoever's following you can follow us. And if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit subscribe and you hit the bell, because we want everyone to be able to see all of the fantastic content that we're putting out both tonight and in the future.
Indeed. And one last thing to remind people of, Eugene, if you are watching the show in the live chat and you've decided, I'm already a patron, or maybe I'm not sure, another great way to support this show and all our other great content at Breakthrough News is to throw some money in the super chat. And you might even get your comment read live on air if we have time and if we like it. So there's that as well.
What criteria do you use, Rania? I mean, I feel like you have sort of a mystery around what you will and will not read. And maybe you don't want people to know. But is there like a rubric?
Well, the rubric is if there's time, mostly. And if it's not entirely an inappropriate comment, which has happened a few times, as you remember.
Yes.
But other than that, it's not really that exciting or difficult. I maybe should have left the mystery there, because now people know. Now people know it's just that there's time.
But since they know that there's like a huge amount of discretion behind it, then I think it'll make people want to rise to the occasion. I'd like to think it'll make them want to rise to the occasion, that they have to try a little bit harder.
If you say something super creative and that's like worthy of, even if we are in the middle of a very intense discussion or debate, if it's that good, I will stop the debate and read your comment on air. So there's something to light a fire.
I don't know if I even agree with that.
Well, that's how good your comment has to be. That's where the discretion comes in. So we'll see if that ever happens. You have to really impress me.
Well, Rania, let me ask you this. I always am sort of thinking about this. You've been traveling around the world. You've been in the Horn of Africa and Cuba, the state of Virginia, New York City. Now you're back in Lebanon. I'm always curious, like, what your reflections are coming back to Beirut, which I know is a place you love, coming back to the Middle East after having been in all these different places. I mean, obviously, I think you see all parts of the world probably different than most of us here in the U.S. But I'm curious if you just had any. I know I'm putting you on the spot here, but you often have interesting reflections when you return to Beirut. So,
Yeah, that's a good point. I kind of came in the middle of the work week, so I've been working on Cuba. My mind is kind of still in Cuba
Mm.
because we're working on Cuba stuff, so I haven't really had a chance to explore it that much. It's only been a couple of days, but I will say, I mentioned this when I was in the US, and I'll say it again. There is a level of, and I'm saying this from a country that is experiencing a very severe economic collapse. There is a feeling whenever I'm in the US of like, it's a scary place because you can fall and there's nothing to catch you
Mm.
anywhere. Like, and I mean that in like a sense of like, if I go to the US and I get really sick or if I need surgery, like I get scared when I go to the US. I'm like, what if I break a bone? Or
Mm.
what if I need to get surgery and it literally bankrupts me? That's not a feeling that I have anywhere else in the world. And sometimes you've probably experienced this too, Eugene, because you travel a lot as well. Sometimes I don't realize how much that weighs on me until I leave. And then
Mm.
there's also like other things that are just really stressful right now about the US because of COVID. And we talked about it on the show that we did live from New York a few weeks ago together. And that's the fact that no one's taking care of you. There's no system in place, no mitigation factors whatsoever. And that virus is just ripping across the country. I mean, I had like 5 COVID scares when I was in the US
Right.
because everyone I knew had it. And it's just now that I'm back here, I know I'm in a country that's not stable, that's kind of always on the precipice of war, if you believe what the media says about it, and where people are really suffering because of the financial collapse here. But at the same time, somehow in this very dysfunctional place with a very weak state, I still feel a little bit safer here in a lot of different ways. And so I guess that's the one thing that I can say just being here for a couple days is I'm like, oh, okay, I can chill now. It's cool. Like if I get sick, it's not going to bankrupt me. And like, I don't know, I'm
Mm.
not going to be. And also the other thing too is I'll leave it you with is that, when I was in New York, especially, but even in the sort of pristine suburbs of Northern Virginia, there was a lot of homeless people begging for money.
Mm.
And every time I go to the US, that situation gets worse and worse to the point where, like, yeah, I mean, in Beirut, it's very normal to have like, these kind of little mafias that run the sort of beggar system that you see in a lot of developing countries. But I actually saw it more in the US this time, especially New York, than I do here. And then just thinking that back to Cuba, not a single person begged for money in Cuba when we were there.
Mm.
So, anyways, that's what I got for you.
Well, I mean, that's good. I think those are interesting reflections. I mean, I think it's, especially for so many people in the United States, the way things are presented abroad. And I think that in turn, the way that shapes people's views of what's going on. I mean, even, just the idea like, America is a shining city on the hill. It's the best country in the history of countries, blah, 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 all the things we normally hear. And I think, honestly, the intense income inequality in America is, part of what sort of creates this distortion effect because there is so much wealth and, at least numerically a relatively large number of people who are living quite well, percentage-wise, maybe not that many. Right. And so people forget, the 140 million people living in poverty, the tens of millions of people, I think almost, I forget the number, I did talk about it on our podcast, The Punch Out, recently. I think like 8 million some odd people saying they aren't confident or they're they don't have a lot of confidence that they're going to be able to pay their rent this month, actually, now that since it's now February. So this was just a couple weeks ago. We were quoting that like there are so many people who are living just right on the cusp of a deeply precarious existence. There are many people who are living there, but then it's all sort of hidden in a way by the realities. And I think in other countries can be a little bit more stark because there isn't this huge, massive, sort of upper middle class sector that is supported by this massive financial industry and the more successful parts of the economy. But really, like kind of hidden in plain sight is, as you say, a huge amount of social insecurity in the United States. And also, I mean, a huge amount of violence and all these, the lack of public services. And it really is just, I mean, we talk about it all the time on this show. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, you mentioned like a huge amount of violence. There's, there's something that's really stressful about the US, like not just the mass shootings and stuff like that, but, I remember, I've read like old articles of people like leaving the Soviet Union or like Cuba in like in the 80s, like to come live in the US. And one of the things that they would complain about is how unsafe it is at night. And of course, that's largely due to the fact that there's so much social and economic inequality in the US, and that leads to a lot of like a high crime rate. But there's like a level of stress that I feel in the US that I don't feel even in Beirut. Like in Beirut, I don't have to like look over my shoulder if I'm walking at 2 in the morning. And the same thing in Cuba. Um, and in the US, there's just like a level of like interpersonal violence that I don't feel it the same way in other places. And then on top of that, there's also just this kind of like added culture of stress where there's expectations, there's markers in life that you're supposed to meet in the US because capitalism tells you you're supposed to meet them. Like you're supposed to own a home by this age and have this much saved in retirement by this age. And if you don't, you're probably going to die alone in like an alley. When you're this age, like that's the mentality that you have in the US. And I forget it when I leave. And then immediately when I come back, I'm like, oh my God, I haven't met my markers. There's so much that capitalism, so this hyper capitalism we have in the US does to you psychologically that you don't even realize until you leave the country. And I know you know what I'm talking about.
No, I know exactly what you mean. It's funny you raise that issue of safety too. A Ukrainian official was briefing the U.S. press because the U.S. is now saying they're withdrawing some number of people from the embassy or whatever and calling on people to leave. And whoever this official was said to the U.S. media, they're safer here than they are, and then like listed a bunch of American cities. And even though in a way I was kind of like, oh, okay, whatever. Like what people say about American cities is often overblown, but there's a kernel of truth to what is being said there.
Right.
In the context of what we see every day here, deeply unfortunately. In the United States. But I thought that was just sort of an interesting take. I mean, there was something similar, that we were hearing from people in Ethiopia where they were, telling all Americans to leave and so on and so forth. And, when you're there, it's just like, I mean, I remember even telling some people about places I've lived in the U.S. and they were just shocked to hear about some of the day-to-day realities.
I'm shocked sometimes to hear about some of the things that you dealt with because I know, like, we've had conversations before. And I'm like, whoa, and it really is. It really is shocking, but it's so normal in the U.S. It's so normal. Like only in the U.S. do I sit in like a restaurant and think, wow, someone could just come in here and shoot up the place. I know that thought does not cross my mind whenever I'm in a public venue anywhere else. Only in the United States, and you don't realize.
So what you're saying is that Beirut is nothing like the Robert Redford, Brad Pitt movie Spy Game.
No, not even a little bit. Unless there's a war. If there's a war, all bets are off the table.
That's set in the 80s, I know. I just needed to take a little shot at Hollywood there.
But
I actually like Spy Game.
But even then, the violence wasn't random. Like even in war, violence isn't random. You know where it's isolated to. In the U.S., it's like anywhere can turn into a war zone at any time. So
well. Let's hope for the best then. But we're going to turn our attention now to what many people seem to want to make a war zone with all the saber rattling that's going on, and that's Ukraine and the broader European theater. And we want to we're very honored to have here on the show Dr. Yurii Sheliazhenko, the executive secretary of the Ukrainian Pacifist Movement, which is a peace organization there in Ukraine. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, thanks to have me.
Well, we're very honored to have you, and I think that a lot of what people in the United States hear in regards to what's happening now is that the U.S. troops that are being sent to Europe are doing a good thing, that they're there to protect Ukraine, that they're there to defend Ukraine, and that we have to do this. I wonder what you would say to Americans about the U.S. actions in the past couple days, sending more troops into the region.
I would like to say stop saber rattling and stop escalating this situation because it is madness. If you really want peace, you should return diplomats on the negotiation table and negotiate peace, not withdraw diplomats and send troops in the field. Of course, for now, there is a small number of American soldiers and NATO soldiers in Ukraine training our troops. And this situation when so-called intelligence about a plan of Russian invasion to Ukraine, and especially this recent information of so-called fake video about governmental offensive to Donbass as pretext for Russian invasion, which was issued. It looks like the next move in scenario of creating war, manufacturing fear, and creating this pretext of escalation of situation between East and West. And this great power politics exhausted Ukrainian people and exhausted all people in the world, including, of course, American people and Russian people. This war machine, this spending of enormous amounts of money, not to build peace, not to diplomacy, not to finance some programs of friendship between people. Instead of friendship, great powers invest into ministries of defense, and ministries of defense are interested not in defense but in offense. It is current militarization of economies, both in United States and unfortunately in Russia and in Ukraine. We now see that our President Zelensky announced increase of the size of Ukrainian army on 100,000 of people. He issued executive order about mandatory military training of all population, and it is a bit of propaganda here, because people in Ukraine hate this post-Soviet system of conscription. But Zelensky promises, we will teach you to be soldiers, and we will abolish conscription. It not seems realistic, like because this mandatory military training have no arrangements for conscientious objectors to military service, and many people probably will object to any fight with Russia on the basis of their non-hostility to Russia. According to the sociology, around 40% of Ukrainian population does not even believe that Russia will invade. And unfortunately, 48% of population believe Russia will invade. Media are effective in manufacturing fear, but only 1/3 of population is convinced that we should take arms and fight Russia. Zelensky is intended to compel all people fight Russia, and unfortunately, those people who don't feel they should take arms, especially those people who believe that war is a crime against humanity and oppose any preparations for war, oppose any wars, defensive or offensive, because any wars in modern world is alleged to be defensive. Usually, of course, it is just propaganda. Those people who have a conscience and obey commandment, thou shalt not kill, and people who even have some second popular point of view that truth and love should be the basis of social institutions built by the soft power of science and technologies, those people have little chances to avoid the state authoritarian machine, which now tends to mobilize all population for this insane war effort. And the Ukrainian Pacifist Movement issued a statement against it. We insist on strict compliance with Minsk agreements, which were approved by the United Nations Security Council. It is internationally recognized peace deal, and we should proceed with it, not undermine it with some saber rattling rhetorics. We need to stop the build-up of troops, accumulation of weapons and military equipment in and around Ukraine. And we demand withdrawal of all troops, cessation of all supplies of weapons and military equipment, which means, of course, both military equipment which the West sends for saber-rattling armament, and Russia support military equipment to their separatists too. Instead of weapons, people should just negotiate peace. Also, we demand open, inclusive, and comprehensive negotiations on peace and disarmament in the format of public dialogue between all state and non-state parties to the conflict, with participation of pro-peace civil society actors. And we believe that neutrality of our country should be enshrined in Constitution of Ukraine, and also Ukraine should join treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, because this great power politics have this even more insane component of nuclear arms race, which endangers all people in the world. And also, of course, we demand to guarantee people human right to conscientious objection to military service, including refusal to be trained for military service, which is very topical in the view of this new executive order of our president, in accordance with Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and General Comment number 22 of United Nations Human Rights Committee. Because, of course, the truth is the first victim of war, and since pacifists tell truth and explain why there are no just wars, just war is fiction, usually pacifists the first people who became, very unpopular and prosecuted by warmongering governments.
Wow. I mean, it's really interesting to hear your perspective, because that's not obviously the perspective that we're getting in the mainstream US media in the US. And so, Yurii, I'm curious if, just to give our audience an idea of what a war would mean for Ukrainians, right? Because all we hear in the US media is whether it's good or bad for America, whether it's good or bad for Russia. But if this were to play out into what the US is escalating, which would be an actual war, what would that mean for average Ukrainians like yourself?
For now, we have this armed conflict in eastern Ukraine, in Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts from 2014. And initially, it was real mess and bloodshed. And before these Minsk agreements were adopted, it was indeed battles. Many people were killed. According to United Nations, number of people killed in this conflict is 13,000, and also more than 30,000 of wounded, and also 1.5 million of internally displaced persons, and there are deprived of many important social economic rights. It is problems in housing. It is some sort of discrimination when their children in school may hear from other school children, you are a separatist, don't speak Russian, and so on. But of course, on the other hand, many peace-loving people, among, for example, teachers and students, among civil society organizations, are working on human rights protection and removing artificial obstacles, for example, for voting of internally displaced people, because they were deprived their right to participate in governance, and to ensure they have home, they have means for living, and so on. And after Minsk agreements, it was fragile ceasefire, and there are not so many victims of armed conflict. OSCE special monitoring mission monitors situation, and they issue daily reports. And for example, before this program, I looked into recent report, and according to this report, of course, hundreds of violations of ceasefire, but today it was no casualties, and they also give comparative statistics. It is this year like previous year. European mediators done a good job helping people in this armed conflict to establish this ceasefire. And of course, it is stubbornness of our government, refusal to comply with Minsk agreements, refusal to conduct direct negotiations between Kiev, Donetsk, and Luhansk. And our government says we should not negotiate because they are terrorists. There are many cases in the world when even if indeed there is situation government and terrorists, some sort of negotiations are conducted, because it is always better to talk instead of violence when we have hope. When instead of hopes we say our principal position is to escalate hostility, it is not good thing, especially if we in Ukrainian media we hear that Ukraine should abandon Minsk agreements and so on, and it is a big hypocrisy diplomacy when, on the one hand, official position is there is no alternative to Minsk agreements, and on the other hand, it is great propaganda about these Minsk agreements. If we comply with it and give autonomy to Donbas, we will ruin independent Ukraine, and we will somehow lose our independence. It is so many exaggeration in it, and so many intentional misinterpretations. For example, talking about amnesty for combatants. If you listen Russian or pro-Russian side, they say that problem is Ukraine just refused to comply with amnesty for combatants when people didn't commit crimes against laws and customs of war. These combatants on both sides can return to peaceful living. It is internationally appropriated many times. This practice was used to stop hostilities and return soldiers to the life of civilians. Instead of that, if you listen Ukrainian propaganda, you will hear claims about Russia demands absolute amnesty, total amnesty, impunity for grave criminals, but no concrete claims. What concrete criminal and what evidence against it? Pro-Russian separatists supposedly to demand it from Ukrainian government to absolve from criminal prosecution, because without any concrete information, just hostility and claims that Russia likes to have all and give Ukraine nothing, which is not true.
Well, Doctor, I'm going to have to stop you there. I think, unfortunately, we're going to have to cut it short there, but I appreciate you giving us, some of the Ukrainian perspective on what's going on there and joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you for inviting me. Have a nice evening.
Same to you. Well, we're going to move forward here and keep it in Europe. We're very happy to have joining us now Reiner Braun, who's the executive director of the International Peace Bureau and is based in Germany. Mr. Braun, thank you so much for being with us.
Good evening from my side.
Well, we're very, very happy to have you here. I think that the American media is in a frenzy against Germany as a country, apparently saying that it's Germany's fault that, Russia feels emboldened in Ukraine and Germans are to blame. So from your perspective, why is it that it does seem that many Germans are very wary of this U.S.-NATO war drive in Ukraine?
Many people in Germany have not forgotten that the Soviet Union has 27 million victims in the Second World War. And they have never forgotten that Russia was attacked in the last 200 years 3 times from the West. So they believe, and this is also the result of the policy of common security by Willy Brandt and Egon Bahr, that we should have friendly relations with Russia. Not relation without any controversies, but relation of friendships and common security. And when you are looking back to the German history, Germany always had a good life and a peaceful living together when it had positive relations to Russia. This starts with Bismarck. This was a part of the Weimar Republic. This was very important in the time of the Willy Brandt and Egon Bahr. And never forget, the German unification would be impossible without the positive vote of the Soviet Union and of Gorbachev. So we have not many Germans, but our government has forgotten it, but many Germans have not forgotten it. So this is the reason that the majority of the German people want to have friendship with Russia. And maybe one more argument. In Germany are living about 8 to 10 million people which were living in former times in different parts of the Soviet Union. They are now a part of Germany, the so-called German Russians, which were going to the Soviet Union, to Russia, about many centuries. And they are a part of our society. They live with us. And we want to live with them, and we can live with them together. Why should we not live with the Russians together? There is no reason, no argument. The only argument is that the German government is following the horrible confrontation politics of NATO and above all of the US. That is absolutely not in the interest of Germany, economically not, politically not, ecologically not. We are living in the common house of Europe. So that is on one side the reason many Germans are believing positive relations to Russia are important. And on the other side, we are really, as peace movement, organizing actions and activity against these confrontational politics of NATO and the United States.
You know, I'm curious, you mentioned NATO. To what extent is there an anti-NATO movement in Germany? I remember during like the Trump era, there was some slight talk about this, but are there any, serious anti-NATO parties in Germany? And is there an anti-NATO sentiment at all on the ground?
When we are looking to the polls, about 1/3 of the German population is concerned about NATO. They are not absolutely against NATO, but they are concerned about the policy of NATO. So there is a background for activities and actions. The big majority of the peace movement and also big part of the left party are more or less against NATO. So there is a background. Because, and we always hear day to day the story, Russia will attack NATO. This is a totally unbelievable story. Can you imagine that a country which is spending 1/14 of military budget for military purposes will attack the others? 1.1 trillion is the NATO budget. 65 billion is the Russian military budget. How stupid must be a country which is spending 1/14 of the military budget to attack the bigger, which is spending 14 times more for it. And maybe another argument to show the stupidness. The economic power of of Russia is 1/10 of the economic power of the European Union. And can you imagine that such a country will attack the others? This is a horrible story of lie, like it was always a story of lie. And this is also the reason many people in Germany are more or less concerned. What does this mean, attacking? Should we not go for negotiations? And I'm very happy, and I was listening to Yurii, that he said negotiations, discussion, dialogue. That is what we need. We need to come back to this policy of common security. That is the way to solve the problem. And to say one word from my side to this agreement of Minsk II. The background of Minsk II is the so-called Steinmeier formula, the Steinmeier agreement from 2018. That said, first step, a federal constitution between the separatists and the rest of the Ukraine. Second, negotiations where everyone could participate. Third, an international agreement about these developments. Fourth, solving the border problems. But 1, 2, 3. And who is not fulfilling the obligation of 1, 2, 3? The Ukrainian government. And why do they not fulfill the Ukrainian government? Do they not do this? Because on one side they have fascists and right-wing people in their government. On the other side, because they know they have the power of the United States behind themselves. So when you are speaking about the development, you have first to say it is the policy of NATO and the United States who is responsible for the situation. I'm not totally sure if every reaction of the Russian government is really brilliant, But in any case, they are reacting from a defensive position, and NATO is acting from a very aggressive position. That is the totally truth, and we are trying to mobilize the people in our country as peace movement for this truth.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the point about, sort of new and broader security architectures, and obviously this is something that Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov raised just the other day with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe meetings in '99 and 2010, that there's a possibility of doing this. I mean, is NATO an obsolete entity when we're even talking about how, security concerns should be discussed and governed in Europe?
For me, NATO's place is the garbage place, because it is out of history. With the end of the Warsaw Pact, it was time to dissolve NATO. But what was our politicians, the US, but also the Europeans doing? They find new jobs for these military tiger. The new jobs was to intervene all over the world. And it is a lie to say that NATO is a North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO is the biggest worldwide military pact, having contracts and negotiations and big common work with Japan, with South Korea, with Malaysia, with Singapore. So NATO is the biggest military alliance in the world. And from my understanding, when you are mentioning common security, there is no place for such an organization. We have for common security the OSCE. And can you imagine, NATO is spending $1.1 trillion US dollars. We have not enough money for social purposes. We have not enough money for solving the climate problem. We don't know how to solve the pandemic. And we need money for all of that. And instead of spending these monies for these social needs, we are spending the money for the stupid military purpose, for the aggressions, for destroying everything. And let me say some sentence to a war in Central Europe. In this region, Ukraine, Poland, Germany, there are 50 nuclear power plants. The biggest European nuclear power plant is in Ukraine. In a war, these nuclear power plants will be immediately destroyed. Can you imagine what this means? Wow. This is the same like putting down nuclear weapons. That's absolutely the same. So the whole Central Europe will be radioactive and totally destroyed. That is the consequences of modern conventional wars in the middle of Europe. So the situation in Europe is totally impossible to make wars without destroying the whole country, the people, the population, the landscape. We will have millions of refugees. So that is the reality. So people who are speaking about war, they are, on one side, they are either idiots, second, they know nothing, or third, they are really killers for the situation in Central and Middle Europe.
Do you, when we're watching this internationally play out, I'm sure there's hawkish voices in Germany, but we're seeing that it's pretty much the US and the UK, their leadership, that are pushing this escalation more than any other country. And we've seen in the US media, there's been a lot of anti-German articles ever since, Germany has been taking this very cautious or seemingly cautious approach. So I'm curious, what's the reaction been in a country like Germany that's always been quite a good ally of the US to watch the US media and US officials really kind of degrade Germany and insult Germany for not, just going along with the war drums?
All of us have so many friends in the United States. And we are working with our friends. We were visiting them, they were visiting us. So maybe let these right-wing media and these media tell whatever they want. We know that we have a lot of American support with our activities, and the US people, the progressive US people, can also rely on us. So I don't care about that. This is the same situation like 2003 by the Iraq War. Oh God, they were accusing us. And we were the winner. We were totally right. Everything that we were saying in 2003 happened in the reality. Everything that we were saying to Afghanistan happened. So, I'm optimistic and also convinced enough that we should keep it and continue doing this. But let me say one word to the German government to destroy illusions. We have this new German government since November. In this government, we have two parties which are horrible anti-Russian parties. These, I'd have to say it very clear, these are the Greens and the Liberals. They are hateful Russian parties. And they try to push the whole government more and more to the position of the US government. And they are quite successful. And so we definitely need a bigger opposition against this policy. And this new government and the leaders of the new government, quite all of them, are coming what I'm always mentioning, the Atlantic Bridge. This is the common organization of politicians from both sides working together to support and to strengthen NATO. All of them, above all our foreign minister. It is a pity to say that this lady is really war-oriented. And so please be very careful when you are discussing about the German government. We have parts in the government, above all by the Social Democrats, which are trying to reduce fights. And we are trying to fight more or less peaceful ways. But they are not against sanctions. So they are only partly peaceful. But they are nearer to us than these war-oriented parties like the Liberals and the Greens. So in Germany, to understand the situation, there is a really hard fight. Which side will get the support of the people? And there we have a very important player, and this is really a horrible, bad player. These are the mass media. I never in the last 20 years saw that the mass media are really the avant-garde in pushing to confrontation and war. Not only the right-wing mass media, like in Germany, the Bild-Zeitung, we are used. But these, what we are calling in the past, left liberal newspapers, they are really pushing for war. When you are looking to the Spiegel or to the Süddeutsche Zeitung, they are horrible what their anti-Russian campaign is doing. So we are also in Germany in a quite difficult situation. We are isolated when we are looking to the elites. We are isolated when we are looking to the mass media. But, we are quite powerful when we are looking to the will of the people. And what we now start with different campaigns and actions and first demonstration is to mobilize these people for more peaceful actions and activities.
No, I think that's an extraordinarily important point, and I think what you're saying about America is true. I mean, I know in cities all around the United States, actually, people are planning to protest here this Saturday against the escalation there in Europe. And I wonder if, obviously this is a terrible situation in so many ways, but if you think that there's a possibility that this could be an inflection point, a turning point for a different kind of politics, on war and peace issues in Europe more broadly, that the sort of, coming so close to such a major crisis that perhaps that could cause, people to look at things very differently than perhaps they have been for the past few years?
I think we should analyze the situation a little bit broader. The confrontation situation in Ukraine is for me only one part of this huge fight which we have now for a new world order under capitalistic circumstances. And then I have first to mention China as the biggest, second, very important crisis with a very dangerous situation when I'm looking to several places, above all for Taiwan. So this fight between these new powers in the world, above all China, but also partly Russia and some of these countries like Brazil and India, and the old historical big powers like United States and also like the superpower European Union, is a fight which is not peaceful, because it's a fight for resources, and the countries and the powers which are becoming weaker are fighting for survival and to be strong. This is not historically new. We know this from the Romans, we know this from the Middle Age, we know this from the First World War and. But this fight is under new circumstances. The first circumstances of nuclear weapons, the circumstances of climate change, the circumstances of limited resources in the world. So it is really a very dangerous fight. And this fight needs an alternative today and also for long term. And this alternative for me is only let us come back to the policy of common security, to accept you and we have interest, but the other side has also interest. And the interests of the other side are in the same way legitimate like our interests are legitimate. And we have to find the common solutions to negotiate, discuss, evaluate the interests and find peaceful solutions by dialogue, negotiations, and discussions. That is the only way I see for Europe, but I also see for other parts of the world. And we have this year the 40 years anniversary of this very famous Olaf Palme report from 1982, which was the background for the common security policy to Gorbachev. And we are now working together with a quite interesting group of high famous people, politicians, scientists, and a new Olaf Palme report on common security. And I think we have to push this report. We have to work with that. We have to bring these ideas of common security again in the public discussion. This is the only way I think we can overcome these worldwide, very aggressive and very confrontational situation.
Mm-hmm. Well, Reiner Braun of the International Peace Bureau, we really appreciate you joining us here on the Freedom Side.
It was a pleasure.
Mm-hmm. Well, always the pleasure is all ours, Rania. But I think I'm glad we were able to talk to both Yurii and Reiner, who I should mention several years ago I had the pleasure of sharing a stage with, sadly on the same issue, the issue of NATO expansion. These are the voices that you never hear. Certainly you never hear anything from Ukraine of anti-war voices, and absolutely the only thing you hear about Germany in the U.S. media, as you alluded to, is that's just a bunch of either brainwashed Putin fanatics or something. You know what I mean? It's wild. Honestly.
Yeah. It is, and it's just really interesting to see American media be so passionate about the necessity for a war that isn't actually going to affect them because they have this huge ocean to protect them. But like the people who would actually suffer get the least platforms unless they have the right attitude, unless it's like a hawkish attitude that aligns with the Atlantic Council or whatever other weapons industry funded think tank is framing the narrative for every media outlet in the U.S.
Yeah, no, it's, well, people think the ocean will protect them, but if it turns into a nuclear war, the next thing you know, the whole world is going to go down. I think people don't really fully understand that any significant nuclear conflict on Earth will basically destroy the whole Earth. The impact of major nuclear conflict is so huge that whoever it may be, I don't know. It just maybe is obvious to people, but I think we forget how potentially devastating these weapons can be, even when used in like a quote unquote limited circumstance.
And I actually heard you make a really good point on the first part of this like 2-part program you did with Brian Becker on the Socialist program, where you were talking about how all of the kind of like various channels that were put into place through various treaties between the US and Russia to try to put limits on a potential nuclear war were actually torn up under the Trump administration mostly. And that was in an effort to prove that he wasn't like pro-Russia, to really like appease all the like liberal anti-Russia hysteria, that we're actually in a more precarious and dangerous situation now. Because whenever there's an escalation like this, all of those different avenues of stopping that escalation no longer exist. That actually that's a frightening point that you made.
Mm-hmm. It really is. Even saying it then, I thought, wow, what a unbelievable situation we're in. And I think that's so true. And it really is, at the very least, at least we saw a brief extension of New START at the start of the Biden administration, no pun intended there, but even that was almost barely happened. And it's being put in the context of, no information about further conversation about reductions in nuclear arms. And that was kind of the last little bit, but so many things have been lost, withdrawn from, distorted. And now, and I think that you've made this point very well in a number of different circumstances, Rania, the way the media is in the United States, to even suggest anything sort of oriented towards peace is, considered to be essentially traitorous, and thus it cannot be done. Even look at the so-called progressives, quote unquote, in Congress, in the context of even their, Politico had an article calling them restrainers. Even the context of their framing is extremely warlike, and it's accepting every single premise of the warmongers. So then when you read it, it's sort of like, well, if what you're saying is true, why aren't we going over there and sending more weapons to Ukraine if there's this crazy, terrible authoritarian force right on their border about to destroy them and kill millions of people? And so people don't even, the level of propaganda is so high. But I know we have our next guest with us here. critically important story, very important story. We want to turn to Leonard Peltier, a political prisoner held for over 40 years here in the United States, who has been diagnosed with COVID-19 very recently. And we are very happy to be joined as we continue the show by Jean Roach, who is Minikozu Lakota and also the co-director of the International Leonard Peltier Defense Committee. Jean, thank you so much for joining us here on the show.
Hello, yeah, thanks for having me.
No, well, it really is an honor. And I guess I just wanted to start, maybe for those who don't know about Leonard, haven't heard about his case, if you could just briefly say, who is Leonard Peltier?
Basically, he's a Native American political prisoner that's been in prison. On February 6th will be 46 years. Even though there has been numerous evidence that he was not given a fair trial. His co-defendants were also acquitted on the basis of self-defense. The FBI attacked the people in Oglala that day in 1975. So Leonard's been in there for a long time. He has worldwide recognition from several different people. You got the Dalai Lama, you have Nelson Mandela. The list just goes on and on. Reason he's been targeted is through a program that's called COINTELPRO that had targeted different movements in the early 70s and late 70s. But anybody that was viewed as a threat to their ideology, basically was targeted. And many members of the American Indian movement were part of the target. Some were jailed, some got out, but Leonard has been in there for a long time. And one of the things is that we always talk about the numerous people that have been victims. People have been abused, not only Leonard, but we have whole communities in Pine Ridge that have been by the feds. They totally disrespect rights. They continue the genocidal cycle that we've been experiencing since contact, day one. They've killed Sitting Bull, they've killed Crazy Horse, and a lot of that was based on fear. We have treaties in this, or nations are sovereign nations, and we have treaties. Half of South Dakota and parts of Nebraska and Wyoming are part of this treaty, and those rights are totally ignored. And Leonard stands up for a lot of these things that we're talking about, Representative.
Leonard has recently been diagnosed with COVID-19. Obviously, this is a critical situation for, potentially anyone who gets it. What is the situation now, and is he being provided with the appropriate health care, or what's his situation?
Well, basically, we don't know. When you have somebody in prison, they make the decisions, even though we have HIPAA laws and they should let the families know. But we found out, that they don't do that. We haven't really had an update from anybody since we heard it on Friday that he had COVID. And one of the really things that worries us is that he has underlying health risk. He's like a high risk person with a aortic aneurysm that's still inside his heart. He's a diabetic. That's another pandemic that Native American people face. So, and that's been on record for a long time. So he should have been released way back, when they had the COVID release. The overwhelming evidence is there. Just haven't really considered it, maybe because there's always a double standard for Native people within the court systems. And not only that, with COVID too, that's like attack on our nations. People we have lost in these last years. And one of the classic examples is how they treated Navajo Nation. They've lost a lot of people because they were totally ignored. And that's the way we are too with or prisoners within the federal court system. We really don't have no rights. They don't have no rights. And there's no watchdog making sure that Leonard should have been eligible for a booster shot, within that time as being a high-risk prisoner, or his health problems. And that was not given to him, even though people within this elderly unit had already gotten boosters. So they always tend to be picking on the indigenous nations. And we all see what happened in Standing Rock. I mean, and there people were not only indigenous, but they were in prayer, unarmed, and they were attacked ruthlessly by the energy corporations. And that's always been part of our belief system, is protecting the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And we really truly believe in our cultural ways of praying and trying to protect from all these attacks. And that's the same way the whole basis of the American Indian movement is spirituality. And if you find within history, that has always been a threat when we pray. It's real basic. And we're just really worried about him, with all these issues that he has, with his health. And we were really wanting to have a COVID release for him. He did his time, One of our brothers was also killed there in Oglala, Joe Stuntz. Never has anybody ever investigated his death, And then we have over 60 people within this time period after Wounded Knee 73 and up to Oglala, where people were killed because they were AIM sympathizers and they were attacked by the goon squads. So this is in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people don't hear it because they seem to have it. Go ahead.
No, please finish your thought.
Yeah, so, it's just a continuation. Like I say, it didn't just start in the 70s. It's been people, and every nation not extinct have issues with the treatment of the second class or the less than human attitude.
So for those who are watching, what can they do to help in this situation with Leonard Peltier?
There's a number of things you can do. You can call the White House, leave messages. You can talk to your senators. We've been reaching out to anybody that's listened. We have the Native American caucus of about 80 senators in Congress that have passed unanimous letters in support of freedom. This goes on. We get a lot of really good support, but they just don't listen to us. They had the little clip with the White House press secretary that actually just kind of like gave attitude. I mean, I think that when you're a journalist, you actually a messenger. And who is blocking these messages from going to Biden? That's my question. Because it's been going on for a long time, 40, 60 years. And the evidence is overwhelming. I don't know. I just feel we can news programs like this, it helps just to get the word out. A lot of people over in Europe, they have taken a lot of steps. They really understand what our movement and what our plight is. We don't want no special treatment. We just want to be treated as humans. And Leonard needs to be recognized and let out of prison for what has happened to him. Anybody else, they would never be there. And the United States champions being the human rights person of the world, but we know a different story. Mm-hmm. And it started way back when they massacred my nation of people in Wounded Knee, unarmed, And that's not the only massacre that's happened in Indian country. But we're still here to tell about it.
Mm-hmm. I absolutely appreciate, not only that, but you being willing to come on and talk to us about Leonard. And I know that there's a petition and several other places that people can come to the fore. And I'll just say, I hope they do, because obviously this is critically important. It's been far too long. One day is even more. Jean Roach, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rania, I mean, it really is an unbelievable story, and Jean mentioned it. There are other people charged with the same thing who were acquitted, and the level of malfeasance by the government, the extreme racism of the jury selection, of the trial, of the venue. It was all set up to get Leonard. There were lies told to even have him extradited from Canada in the first place. His name has been smeared in many different ways, really just unfortunate on a range of different fronts. But 46 years, COVID-19, they sent him to isolation.
No booster.
No booster. And it's one of these things that every time that there's a chance for Leonard to get out, there's this huge mobilization by these FBI agents, who will come out. And this happened in 1999 with Bill Clinton, and it looked like it was very close for Leonard to get out. And it was like thousands of FBI agents and former agents start waging this huge campaign saying he's a cop killer and this, that, and the third. Disgusting.
Of course. Yeah, every time. It's just it's a depressing topic, but so necessary to continue to come back to, because there are so many people who are just like growing old behind bars as political prisoners in this supposedly free country that we have, where they continue to punish you and like forever, even letting you get sick when they can prevent it. It's incredible.
Indeed. Well, we are going to move the show forward here, going to turn our attention to Palestine, and we are very honored to be joined here by Ali Abu Nima, who's the director of the Electronic Intifada, also the author of The Battle for Justice in Palestine. Ali, thanks so much for being back with us.
Thank you so much.
Well, Amnesty International released a report saying that there's apartheid in Israel. I think a lot of people saying, thanks for catching up. But nevertheless, it's a big name, Amnesty International. So how do you rank the importance of this report? And, I'll leave it there.
Well, on Hi Rania too. It's nice to see you again so soon. I think one way we can judge it is by Israel's reaction, and Israel is pissed. They are really, really pissed. And I think understandably so, because apartheid is defined in international law as a crime against humanity, and it is up there alongside genocide as one of the worst things you can do. And of course, apartheid is the racial oppression, systematic racial oppression of one group over another, something that shouldn't exist in the 21st century, especially not in a country alleging that it's a democracy, let alone the only democracy in the region, when in reality it is committing this crime against humanity of racial oppression and persecution. And Israel is really pissed because Amnesty International is the biggest human rights group in the world. It is not just, Amnesty is not just saying, okay, we have done a report and we're putting it out there and you can read it or you can put it up on the bookshelf or whatever you want to do. Amnesty is saying we are launching a global campaign against Israeli apartheid. And this is an organization with chapters in dozens of countries, and which, love it or hate it, has been a very effective campaigning organization over many decades. So it really mainstreams the fight to end Israeli apartheid in a way that even, this Amnesty report comes almost exactly a year after B'Tselem, a leading Israeli human rights group, issued a similar report, and then last April, Human Rights Watch did the same, and then now we have Amnesty coming out. So it's not just that Amnesty is the biggest organization, the best known global organization to do this, it's the accumulation, it's that, the most mainstream and respected human rights organizations can no longer avoid the conclusion of the reality that Palestinians themselves, of course, have been describing accurately for many decades.
Ali, I saw that there was it the Amnesty branch, you can correct me here, the Amnesty branch in Germany distanced themselves from this report, which I found very interesting. And you have been somebody who's been very outspoken about the way that Germany deals with the issue of Israel, which is a very special way, particularly compared with its historical responsibility for what's happening to Palestinians, as well as the way it behaves in comparison to even other Western countries. It's just like unconditionally, Israel can do no wrong. So can you talk a little bit about what happened with the Amnesty branch in Germany, and give us your thoughts on why the Germans behave this way when it comes to Israel, and why it's even more morally reprehensible?
Right. So the German chapter of Amnesty said that they're not going to promote this report or organize any events around it, which is, of course, disgraceful. And I think Amnesty's international governing body should consider whether the German chapter should not be sanctioned for its refusal to advocate for universal human rights, because the whole idea of human rights is they should be universal. And here's the German chapter of Amnesty saying that Palestinians should be singled out to not deserve full and equal human rights. And that's utterly disgraceful. But that fits into the bigger context of the way Germany has failed to deal with its history of, the German state murdered millions of Jewish people just for being Jews. And instead of dealing with that, they've tried to externalize and export their guilt by supporting the unconditional persecution of the Palestinian people by the Israeli state. And this is supposedly in order to show that, Germany has learned the lessons of history, but it shows that they've learned nothing at all. Because, first of all, equating the actions of the state of Israel with all Jews is reprehensible, is anti-Semitic. But that's what Germany is saying. When they say that if you criticize Israel, that makes you against Jews, they're saying that Israel and the Jewish people all over the world are the same thing. And that's utterly deplorable. So basically, Palestinians are being made to pay for the European genocide of European Christian Jews, and it's absolutely disgraceful. And it shows that Germany, along with other European states and, of course, the United States in the lead, is completely complicit with this brutal and barbaric system of Israeli racial oppression and apartheid.
I
You know,
mean,
I'm
I
glad-
also saw. Oh,
No,
we
sorry.
do this at least once or twice throughout the show when we're not in the same place. It's got to happen. Please go ahead, Eugene.
Thank you. Well, no, I was just glad you brought up the issue of the complicity of the EU countries, because, I mean, I wonder how you evaluate what we saw with all those EU envoys going out to Sheikh Jarrah. I think they went out there, and a few others. It was just the strangest thing. All of a sudden in my feed, I see like all these, European diplomats out there decrying, the growth of settlements, which, I mean, I'm happy to decry it, but it just seemed almost cruel the way they were doing it, as if like they were just sort of innocent bystanders.
It's disgusting. I find it deplorable. They go out and they do these photo ops with Palestinian families whose homes are about to be demolished by Israel, and they say, look at these poor Palestinians, and here we are to show our solidarity with them. Well, their governments are the ones arming and funding Israel to commit these crimes. Their governments are the ones who are using every possible international forum to block accountability for Israel. The German government, along with other European governments, issued briefs in the International Criminal Court to oppose an investigation of war crimes in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip. All of these European countries in the United States are opposing investigations by the Human Rights Council. So it's really cruel. It's cynical. I would say sociopathic to go and pretend to show sympathy with people while you're aiding and abetting the people who are killing them. We have a saying in Arabic about the person who murders the victim and then walks in his funeral. And that's exactly what these European states are doing. They participate in the oppression, the murder, the expulsion, the dispossession, the persecution of Palestinians in material ways. Israel literally couldn't do it without them. And then they throw a pity party to say, oh, these poor Palestinians, oh, and we're funding schools for them, and we're funding, Israel demolishes the schools that the European Union builds. Israel has demolished many schools built by the European Union. What does the European Union do? Do they sanction Israel? Do they punish Israel? Do they hold it accountable? No, they give it more support. And on the same day that Amnesty issued its report on Israeli apartheid, the European Union announced $700 million to fund to link Israel's electricity grid with the European Union. And one of the consequences of this will be that the European Union is providing Israeli settlements in occupied Palestinian land with European electricity. So that's just one example of many. But the guns, the bombs, the bulldozers, the bullets, the tear gas, the weapons they use to commit the crime of apartheid are all thanks to the United States, Canada, and the European Union primarily.
It's so interesting how you just frame that, because I can think of so many people who've worked in, whether from the US side, have worked in like the consulate in Jerusalem. And the same goes for members of the EU and various European countries. Once they've spent time there as individuals, they are very well aware of the fact that this is like a disgusting system that they're witnessing, and that it's apartheid and it's horrible. And they won't say it publicly because they're there to serve their country's agenda and foreign policy. And I just want to bring it to that for a moment, because I think it's important to remember that this isn't just an issue of Israel's being mean and committing human rights violations, and if we can just stop that, everything would be fine. Everything would be better if they would stop doing that, but it serves a bigger purpose, right? There's a reason that the EU and the US and Canada give Israel this unconditional aid and are constantly defending Israel. Can you talk a little bit about what the purpose of Israel is for Western hegemony in the Middle East? Because at the end of the day, that's what it comes down to.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of that's such a big discussion, and so many direct. Yeah, it's a big question, but I mean, one thing that came to mind as you were speaking is like, well, what's the purpose of Canada? What's the purpose of the United States?
Right.
Why should any of them exist? And rather, I think the question is, how and why do they exist? These are all settler colonies that are founded on genocide, slavery, and racial oppression that still exists. I have right behind me what for me was a seminal book of understanding how it still exists is the new Jim Crow. So Israel is part of this system. So for them, Israel should exist the same way Canada should exist. They don't question it because they are all part of the same system and mindset and ideology. So that's sort of the biggest picture response I can give. But of course, Israel is Israel is a client of the United States and the US empire. And that is very well illustrated by what's happening even today, where the Israeli so-called defense minister, the Israeli war minister, Benny Gantz, a man with the blood of thousands of Palestinians on his hands, including hundreds and hundreds of children who he murdered in Gaza, both as the Israeli army chief and as the defense minister, is in Bahrain today, another American client state, and and this comes after the Israeli president was in the United Arab Emirates the other day. These countries are all bases of U.S. imperialism. Bahrain is the home of the American Sixth Fleet, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, of course. These are all U.S. client regimes, and Israel is another U.S. client regime. And so they function the same way Iran functioned under the Shah before the revolution, which is to help bolster U.S. hegemony, which of course now is fraying and crumbling and creaking on its pillars like we haven't seen before, as as particularly China becomes a rising global economic and political power. One interesting thing in this regard is that as Israel has found it harder to sort of get big Western companies to come in and build its settler colonial infrastructure, because boycott campaigns have successfully driven a number of major infrastructure companies out of Israel, like Veolia, that's a big international firm, was forced out by boycott campaigns. Israel has increasingly turned to Chinese firms for major infrastructure. And the United States, because it views China as a rival, has actually forced Israel to curtail its dealings with China and to actually clear all of its major deals with China through the U.S. State Department before doing so. So that illustrates again how the U.S. sees Israel as, hey, you're in our camp, you're our base, you're our son of a bitch, to borrow a phrase, and so therefore you will do as we tell you.
Rania, I was just giving you a chance there.
I was like, are we gonna do it, or are we gonna talk at the same time? Are we?
No, I'm waiting for you.
Did you want to know? Okay, it's me. All right, cool. Ali,
I can just keep talking, but I wanted to give you guys a chance. It's your show. I wanted to give you a chance.
Me and Eugene usually have a good rhythm, but then we did one in-person show where we were sitting next to each other, and I think that has disrupted our ability to not jump in at the same time. So last week we had a few kerfuffles where we both jumped in at the same time. But no, I mean, I think that's such an excellent point, and I actually recently had you on, and we talked quite a bit. If people want to hear more of what Ali thinks about the coming multipolar world and what it means to Palestine, I highly recommend you, after this show, go check out the interview we did at the beginning of the year. But, I did notice one thing that Amnesty did. Of course, it's good that Amnesty came out and did this report. We're all kind of like Eugene said at the beginning, really? I mean, it's 2022.
Took you this long. Yeah.
It took you this long, but okay, great. Like, this report's out. It does mean something. It is important. But at the same time, they did a weird thread about the issue of apartheid and what's happening in Palestine. And there was one tweet in particular where Amnesty said, we don't take a position on the occupation. And I know they got beat up a lot on Twitter over that. I'm curious your thoughts on that, because that seemed a bit odd to me, that they would come out. Nobody asked them to, but they came out and said, we don't take a position on the occupation. And I feel like it kind of says something about the limits of the human rights paradigm when it comes to this issue of settler colonialism and ethnic cleansing and land theft. But please go ahead.
Absolutely, it does. But my understanding, that tweet thread, including a ridiculous tweet, I think I have it here, where they say, they kind of do this thread. I'm very old-fashioned. I actually printed the tweet out. Who does that? So does Amnesty oppose Israel's military occupation of Palestine? Amnesty hasn't taken a position on occupation. Our focus has been on the Israeli government's obligations as the occupying power under international law. But Amnesty has taken no position on the occupation itself. That's a really weird tweet. But an interesting thing to notice is that it comes from Amnesty International USA. Remember that Amnesty is not a US-based organization. It's a UK-based organization. It was founded in the UK. So Amnesty International USA is one of its chapters. And so I interpret that as sort of the American branch, which is more sort of defensive and susceptible to the American taboo on criticizing Israel, kind of trying to like cover its arse by saying, hey, look, look how unbiased we are. We don't even condemn the occupation. So to me, it's a signal of how even now there's still a lot of fear around having this discussion. And so in a sense, you could say it's a bit like how the German chapter of Amnesty dissociated itself from the report. But the report is there and it's endorsed by, it is in Amnesty's name. That said, you're right, Rania, that it still exists within the framework of, liberal human rights discourse. Nonetheless, it does go a lot further than ever before. And I think Amnesty, to its credit, states that the Israeli system of apartheid was established in 1948 at the same time that Israel was established. In other words, I think it goes further than we've seen many liberal groups go before, which often tried to say, oh, well, everything was fine before 1967. But then in 1967, when Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza, Israel lost its soul. But before that, it was this beautiful kumbaya, beautiful thing. It's only in 1967 that Israel lost its way and we're worried about its soul. To its credit, the Amnesty report really goes back to 1948 and really says that from the beginning, this was a system of apartheid. But as my colleague Maureen Murphy at the Electronic Intifada wrote in an excellent article we published today, she points out that, for all the good analysis in the Amnesty report, it really falls short on understanding that all of this is happening within the context of settler colonialism. And that's fundamental. The goal of Zionism and the goal of the settlers who came from Europe was not to come and establish an apartheid regime. Their goal was to take the land from the Palestinians and get rid of the Palestinians. The fact that there is an apartheid regime is a consequence of the fact that Israel failed to get rid of all the Palestinians and therefore, from its perspective, was forced to rule them by apartheid. But Israel's preference is to get rid of the Palestinians altogether. And so settler colonialism is, if we take it to its logical end, is actually a genocidal ideology. And I didn't catch all of the prior discussion regarding Leonard Peltier, but that's an exact parallel. The Europeans who came to the United States didn't come with the goal of dominating native people in this country. They came with the goal of taking the land. And if that meant exterminating them, they were fine with that. If that meant ruling them through cruel oppression or putting them in reservations, that's what they do. But the ultimate goal was to take the land. And that is the goal of Zionism, and that is the goal of Israel today. And in a sense, from Israel's perspective, apartheid is a temporary measure until they can get rid of the Palestinians altogether, one way or the other, and take the land.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, very important distinctions, and I think very notable to see how the tide just continues to rise against Israeli apartheid. And certainly I do hope people check out Maureen's article and follow the Electronic Intifada all the time, every day. Really appreciate your work and everyone there, Ali, and thanks again for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rania, I mean, it really, it's one of these things that it's just, I guess I wasn't there, so it's hard for me to say, but, the turn to just the intense, aggressive, just blunderbuss campaign by Israel to deny they've ever done anything wrong. I mean, as much as obviously it's a very strong state, to me it seems like it's really a growing sign of weakness. I mean, I always point out to people that the apartheid regime in South Africa became the most violent really in like the last 10 or 12 years of its existence, partially because hegemonically that was all they could do, because the mask was so ripped off. It was only raw brute force. And I think to Ali's point about how there's been such a mythos around Israel for so long, such a mythos about the 48 to 67 period, all these other different aspects to it. And I just think more and more people around the world, quite frankly, just don't buy it. And so the level of escalation, not only of violence in the occupied territories, but the level of attack that is launched at anyone who dare raise a voice anywhere in the world, increasing exponentially, to me, to some degree, is a reflection of the inability of Israel to control the narrative on this issue any longer.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we saw it just like a month or so ago with the way they behaved when Emma Watson came out. And what did she post? Like a photo that just said solidarity with Palestine or something?
I'm not even
And the
sure it said
response
solidarity
was
with Palestine.
insane.
I think it might have just said like solidarity is like a verb or one of those little things. And there was like some Palestinian imagery in the back. I think I could be wrong about that. But to me, it was so subtle. It was shocking.
Yeah, and the response was insane. You had Israeli diplomats and officials coming out and calling her an anti-Semite. I mean, it's a sign of weakness. It's a sign of the narrative shifting. And it's not just this person here and that person there. I mean, we see it with every new war that Israel launches that captures the international gaze. I really do see it among privately. These really cowardly officials know the reality.
Sure.
A lot of times
totally.
we know, and a lot of times the reason that they go along with it is because it behooves their careers, it behooves their campaigns, and it's in line with US policy. But privately, there's a limited amount of aggression and brutality that the people who support Israel are going to be willing to put up with in the future because it looks so bad. And we see that more and more. So this isn't sustainable. And we're going to see Israel act out. And I do, just because I know we're going to talk about the region a bit, I just do want to note that Israel's existence in the Middle East as the settler colonial entity, it's not just Palestinians who suffer the consequences of it. It's literally the entire Middle East, the entire region. It's like Israel's creation, it's violent creation. It was like an asteroid hitting the Middle East. It remade the entire place. There's Palestinian refugees in every single country of the Middle East because of the violent creation of Israel. There's been wars and land theft, not just of Palestine. Israel still occupies the Golan Heights, which is Syrian land. Israel still occupies parts of, pieces of southern Lebanon. And Israel and Hezbollah and Lebanon have gone to war on several occasions because the idea of greater Israel and having the desire to just need control over the region and be the strongest party leads Israel to carry out acts of aggression all around it when any party presents a challenge to that hegemony. And we see the situation between Iran and Israel and how that affects the entire region. So it really is like the existence of Israel as a settler colonial colony, as this aggressive sort of Sparta state, affects not just Palestinians, but everyone in the region.
Now, why would you slander Sparta like that?
I'm sorry. You're right. That was unfair. Unfair.
No. Well, it actually isn't unfair. But let's not get into Greek history here.
I don't want to upset you.
Well, if you want to talk about the Peloponnesian War, we can do that next week for sure. Wait, is the Peloponnesian Athens versus Sparta? Or is that Greece versus
You're getting
Persia?
too historian on me.
Sorry. All right. Well, someone in the
you're
chat
gonna make me
can
look
tell me.
really bad. You're gonna make me look really bad.
Well, anyway, I almost got into it, but we're not going to. Well, Ron, yeah, and I think your point is obviously very well taken. And of course, we've seen the Israeli attacks on Syria on a regular basis and, many of the other things that they've done. And, in that regard and sort of slightly segueing here, the big news that came out this morning, United States Special Forces launched a raid in Syria in the Idlib province region. President Biden saying that this should be a message to quote unquote terrorists everywhere that American forces could take you out. That's an exact quote, anywhere around the world. A lot of pieces in this, it killed the head of ISIS or the current head of ISIS. I'm assuming there's a new head of ISIS. There's a lot of different pieces to this. I guess maybe the first thing, Rania, to me that stands out is, what is this ISIS individual doing in Idlib which from what I have read in the international media is a haven for peace and freedom against authoritarianism, but apparently ISIS is in there running things. But I mean, and I know I'm being partially facetious, but when you read what's happening about ISIS in Syria, they'll say, well, ISIS is over there in eastern Syria, the remnants of ISIS. And then you have the leader of ISIS over here in Idlib, which is supposed to be good. So there's sort of a mental attempt in the sort of media presence to separate the two pieces of, opponents of the Syrian government. Sort of there's ISIS over here, and then there's the good people in Idlib over there. And maybe he's just living in an apartment and there's no ISIS presence at all in Idlib. Maybe I'm just reading too much into it. But what do you think about that fact?
So I actually want to contextualize this recent raid because I don't think we've heard about the U.S. kind of like hitting ISIS or targeting ISIS until now. It sort of suddenly came up. And you're right. This is the second time that the U.S. has killed the leader of ISIS, and it was in Idlib, Syria, because the last leader of ISIS, the original leader of ISIS, Baghdadi, was also killed during Trump's administration in Idlib. And it was strange, right? Because like you said, Idlib is this place where we're supposed to believe it's like an opposition zone of people in Syria who don't like Assad. And for a long time, that's what we're hearing. But I want to contextualize what happened because there's actually been a bit of an ISIS resurgence in certain parts of Iraq and Syria that led to a lot of violence the last couple of weeks that I don't think people in the UN even know is happening because these places only get attention when it affects America. But there was a lot of ISIS operations the last few weeks. First in Diyala province in Iraq, there was actually 11 Iraqi soldiers who were slaughtered at a checkpoint by ISIS, which you probably didn't hear about. Around this, well, you may have, but I'm sure many of our viewers have not. And around the same time, there was in northeast Syria in the city called Hasaki, which is controlled by the Syrian PKK. People probably know it better as the YPG. The Americans call it the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces. Hasaki is an Arab city, but it's controlled by the SDF. And there was an incident there where, this is actually crazy what ISIS did. Up to 100 ISIS attackers were involved in this super complex operation to attack this prison in Hasaki, which houses thousands of ISIS prisoners. And this attack, it involved an attack on the checkpoints, like bomb attacks on the checkpoints. 2 suicide car bombs basically broke into the perimeter of the prison at the same time. And then as this is happening at the same time inside the prison, they were coordinating with people inside the prison. ISIS guys inside staged an uprising to take it over from the inside. So the SDF defenders that are backed by the US, a lot of them ended up fleeing. So ISIS was able to control the prison and escape into the surrounding neighborhoods. And there were battles for like several days. And it took a couple of days before the Americans and the British Special Forces got involved to help secure the area around it. And the Americans, like with armored vehicles, were involved in shooting just the hell out of the place. And American helicopters and bombers were involved in bombing the place. Again, it's kind of shocking that nobody heard this about this in the US media. It wasn't played up because 45,000 civilians around this area had to flee their neighborhoods, flee for their lives because of the US bombing of these ISIS people. And also, it's also just on a side note, it's a little bit like ironic because this happened next to an old prison. This was next to an old prison. The prison was an old prison. The British happened to be building a new prison that was going to be more secure to put these ISIS guys in. And that's why ISIS had attacked now. Just a little bit of background there. But the people basically were going to end up moving to a high security prison. That didn't happen. But as these battles are taking place, the only reason that the SDF was able to take back control, which they ultimately did, was because of the bombing that was provided by the US and the UK. And the reason I bring that up is because this is another example of one of these armies that the US trains and arms that is completely incompetent and too weak to actually do anything. This might remind you of like the Afghan army, how it fell immediately after US.
Quite
right, that's what I'm saying is like the US, because so when we hear the US saying that the reason it's in Syria, well, but when you hear the U.S. saying that the reason it stays in Syria is because, we have to keep supporting, that they do it under the auspices of fighting ISIS. We have to keep supporting our partners on the ground who are fighting ISIS. Well, your partners on the ground literally cannot do it without your air support. Like without your air support, they all end up fleeing because they can't take on ISIS. ISIS will blow themselves up. They don't care. And they end up fleeing, and then you end up having ISIS take over places. And that's the reason. And the reason I bring that up is because, you know, the ISIS people that I'm talking about that are in this area, they basically move in between Idlib and eastern Syria quite freely. The way they move is when there are zones that are failed state zones. And there are lots of these areas in eastern Syria where either the SDF can't deal with the security threat, or where the Syrian government has become too weak. Because at one point, the ISIS actually fled and took over an area that's actually under Syrian government control after this prison break happened. And the reason they were able to do that is because the Syrian government has been weakened by US war for 10 years and now US sanctions that are just completely hollowing out the state. And the weaker the state becomes, the more likely that these non-state actors have the ability to take over areas. When it's not controlled by anything, that's when it's good for ISIS. But we see the result of the Americans weakening the state in these regions because ISIS remains a problem. It can still operate. And also in northern Syria, which is where Idlib is, you have the head of ISIS being killed there because he can move between these places. And the reason he can move between these places is Idlib's under the control of who? It's supposed to be under the control of Turkey's allies, but who are Turkey's allies? Are Nusra, the Al-Qaeda, the former Al-Qaeda affiliate that now goes by HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. So I'll just reiterate, this is the second time a leader of ISIS has been killed in Idlib, and it's because of the US war on Syria that sought to create these failed state zones to bring down the government of Bashar al-Assad, and they're still trying to bring down that government by weakening it through economic war that we don't even hear about now. And in the process of killing this ISIS leader, the reason they did it is because of ISIS has been sort of regrouping and doing these attacks in various places in Syria and Iraq. But the fact that they killed this ISIS leader the way they did, apparently in this raid, they also managed to kill 6 children and 4 women. And despite that, you had Joe Biden tweet this morning how, you know, basically applauding what he called the bravery of our armed forces. And the Pentagon called it a successful mission. So while they're still trying to destroy Syria, still trying to weaken Syria, that gives rise to these ISIS actors. Then they go in and kill civilians while killing ISIS. I mean, it's just an insane policy that leads to so much civilian suffering. And no one talks about it until something extravagant or something extraordinary like what happened today happens.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's very important context, and I think very good points. And just for you to know, Joe Biden stressed that they had done everything possible to minimize civilian casualties. They're always doing that. It's like how Israel says they're the most moral army on earth. You know, I think it's like you say stuff like that because since no one has any real reference point, it's like, well, they did everything they could to minimize casualties. So you just assume, but you don't really know. And doing everything they can to minimize casualties means doing basically nothing. I mean, I don't want to get deep into bombs and things like that and how they work in these raids, but it's crazy.
But we also keep, like, this is on top of, we keep hearing these, or we keep getting these New York Times, like, investigations coming out or leaks from, I mean, there was like in the last few months, there was leaks from people who were involved in like a really big bombing campaign when they were trying to rout ISIS in Syria. And they killed like 70, like a crazy amount of civilians, like 70 civilians, and then tried to cover it up. And officials leaked that. Like every couple months, something comes out. We recently found out that they almost bombed a dam that could have killed like 10,000 people. I mean, we keep hearing when it comes to Syria, all of these stories come out years later. At what point are we going to care about what's happening in Syria now? Right. The U.S. is starving Syria. Like Syrians,
say more about that. Like for the average Syrian right now, like when they wake up, go through their daily motions, what are the things that they're facing?
Well, they have to wait in really long lines to get basic things like bread. The government's still able to provide bread, but the problem is, you know, Syria's most fertile land and its most oil-rich land is occupied by the U.S. and its proxy forces. The SDF that I talked about earlier being that proxy force. So literally there are U.S. soldiers occupying Syrian oil fields. So Syria has like no electricity most of the time. Damascus, this is a place, by the way, this isn't like Lebanon. Syria always had a very strong state. And as a result, they always had almost 24-hour electricity in Damascus. That doesn't exist anymore. In Syria, people have electricity cuts all the time. Imagine that happening in the scorching hot summer or happening right now. It's very cold outside and people don't have heat. It gets really cold in parts of Syria. So you're talking about being very cold, maybe not having electricity. You're talking about not having enough to eat. I think like a crazy number, like 70 or 80% of Syrians are like food insecure at this point. And this is a country that used to be self-sufficient in food production before the war. It was also, by the way, a country that was self-sufficient in medicine production. It had so many medicine factories. During the war, a lot of the various armed groups, many of which received backing from the US and its allies, would actually take over pharmaceutical factories. And after they did, they would strip it of all its equipment and send it to Turkey, where a lot of it's sitting now, by the way. That happened also. Syria used to make a lot of its own clothes. They don't anymore. So think about, that's a 10-year difference. We're in 2022. So 11 years ago, Syria was making its own medicines. It was making its own food. It had a rising economy. It had one of the best school systems in the region. It had one of the best healthcare systems in the region. And you compare it to now, and people are leaving as quickly as they can because there is no future there. There are no prospects there. If you do still have a job in Syria, you make almost no money because the currency is completely worthless. And you have trouble buying basic items, basic foods. Don't have electricity. It's not a pleasant, you don't have to wait in line for gas if you can get any. And that means cooking gas and gasoline for your car. It's not a pleasant lifestyle. This is the US saying that they're punishing the government of Bashar al-Assad, but there are millions and millions of Syrians who are living with the consequences of that so-called punishment. And no one talks about it. No one cares. And people I talk to in Syria tell me that, who are still there, because a lot of the people I knew in Syria have gotten out. They've gotten visas elsewhere. But the people who are still there that I know say it's harder to live there now than it was when there was a war. So that's what people don't understand about economic warfare. Economic warfare creates miserable living conditions for everyone, almost everybody. And also it's turned Syria, US says, Syrian regime is so corrupt. This is against corruption. Well, what makes a country way more corrupt is putting it under sanction. It actually provides lots of new opportunities for people who already have a lot of money because they end up monopolizing various industries. The sanction system ends up leading to new businesses, like new industries that it's in and of itself, mafia style industries, because you have to get things into the country. There's black markets that are created where you can hike up prices and then, certain people who have, especially after a war, end up dominating certain industries because they were the most powerful actor. So you have a situation where Syria is turning into this mafia state where the state has started to hollow itself out for sources of revenue because of the sanctions. It's a travesty for everyone. It's so outrageous that there's people that support these kinds of measures. They don't understand that sanctions do kill people and sanctions do destroy families. They destroy lives. And if they had to live under them, they would be completely miserable too. Sanctions are a form of warfare. They're not an alternative to warfare.
I think that's a very, very important point. And I think it's one that is obviously, well, I don't know if it's lost on people, but it's at least something that's pumped into people to feel that that's the humane option. And it's sort of well, we don't want to go to war. We don't want to be over there bombing people. But yeah, some sanctions. And it's also this whole issue of targeted sanctions and all this, that, and the third. There's always some attempt to try to make it seem like it's not exactly what it is. And then you have things like, Israel bombing the Latakia port and, constantly bombing all over Syria, constantly on a regular basis. I mean, it's almost like people will write about it now as if it's a quote unquote frozen conflict. Sometimes you'll see that as it refers to Syria, but it really feels like that's not the case at all. It's just it's a slow grinding conflict, but it's not actually frozen. There's sort of everyday violence, both direct and indirect, happening on people.
Yeah, and I think at this point, we've both been to sanctioned countries.
Mm-hmm.
We went to one together. We went to Eritrea.
We did.
There's some places that are able to mitigate maybe the worst aspects of it because they perhaps have, in the case of Eritrea, they have a very self-sufficient development model that has an ability kind of baked into it to deal with not being able to rely on the outside. So even though they're under sanction, it doesn't feel as bad as it feels in Syria. And I would say the same about Cuba. Cuba has a socialist development model And because of that, as much as everybody suffers as a result of sanctions and people do die due to lack of things because of sanctions, there is kind of a built-in capacity to mitigate some of the worst impacts of it. But with a country like Syria that's been bombed and a bunch of armed groups have been funded to destroy it for that happened for like 5 to 7 years, and there's still parts of the country that still experience war. Like I just described a couple weeks ago, 45,000 people fled an area of Syria because of massive US and British bombing to rout ISIS. That kind of stuff is still going on because of that, and because the sanctions on Syria are so severe. This country has been destroyed, and the sanctions are meant to make it impossible for the government to rebuild what was destroyed. So they can't even get in building materials in Syria to just rebuild homes. They're prevented from doing that under the guise of supporting, human rights in Syria.
Right. If you
So
give them
Syria is
cement,
like-
they'll build bunkers or something.
Exactly. Because it's like a dual use item, right? So Syria's in that situation. And also, Syria used to have somewhat of an interesting development model that did make it self-sufficient. And that's why it did have healthcare, and it did have schools, and it did have the ability to make its own medications and things like this. But that's been destroyed by the war. And then the capacity of the state to do that's been destroyed, but also the elements of the state that had the ideology to even carry out that capacity no longer exists, because war wears that down. It really does. So now what you have left is a state that can't even respond to the needs of its people like it otherwise could, because it's been softened up by war. Now it's being softened up by sanctions. And who knows what's going to come next after that? Because we saw, Iraq was under sanction for 13 years? And it was meant to destroy its ability to feed people, destroy its ability to have electricity. That was all intentional. It was meant to soften the population up. So all that's to say, this war against Syria is not over.
Right.
It's ongoing, and it's going to be going on, I think, for a very long time from now.
Yeah, and the goals remain the same, regime change over and above anything else. And whether it's fast or slow, it's obvious that, the U.S., the EU, even though the Gulf states I know are now trying to pretend like they're walking it back, I'm sure they'd be happy to see, the fall as well. It really is just pernicious on so many levels. This is sort of it's not a random question, but it's sort of a little bit of a pivot, but connecting our past two stories. What has happened to the Palestinians in Syria? Many Palestinian refugees I know used to find a home in Syria. What's the situation there?
There's still many of them there. Some of them came back to Lebanon during the war. And they're just, Syria was one of the places where Palestinians actually refugees had more rights and were treated more as citizens than in other parts of the Middle East where they were given refuge. And they're more Syrian at this point. Like once you're like second generation, you kind of become culturally Syrian, and you're like a part of that society. And a lot of them are still there. Experiencing the same problems that other Syrians are experiencing. They might still have their homes. They don't. The economic warfare is affecting them the same. Some of them did end up coming to Lebanon and coming to the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon, which were way worse experiences than the actual normal suburban nice neighborhoods that they lived in Syria. And then, interestingly enough, those who did come to Lebanon, there became this rivalry between the Palestinians from Syria and the Palestinians in Lebanon, because they both sort of adopted the viewpoints of those two countries, and it's kind of a mess. But yeah, they're still there. They're still there experiencing all the same things, or getting out if they can. And like I told you, there's also, one element of this I didn't mention is the brain drain.
Right.
The war and the sanctions led to a huge brain drain. Like I told you, Syria had this amazing medical system. Well, a lot of those doctors have left because they don't have the equipment they need to be proper doctors in Syria. And they also, aren't able to make a living like they used to being a doctor in Syria. So a lot of doctors have left to go work in other countries, a lot of teachers, a lot of engineers, lawyers, the sorts of professionals that you need to build a country and to rebuild a country are gone in Syria. So that actually, all of what I'm talking about is going to have such a destructive impact on this place for generations to come, in a way like happened in Iraq. A lot of what I'm saying has happened in Iraq over and over again, because Iraq has just kind of experienced constant bouts of war for the last like 20, 30 years. And you see the impact of that over generations, where a lot of people have left and live in different parts of the world. It changes the demographics of the country, because certain religions get, or it's easier for them to get visas to go to Germany or to go to the US or to go to Canada than it is for other religions. So like, it's, always funny to me when you see these right-wingers freaking out in the US, not even just right-wingers, liberals too, about the fate of Christians. Well, in the Middle East, one of the reasons that a lot of the oldest Christian populations in the world are fewer and fewer in this region, particularly when it comes to Palestine or Iraq or Syria, is because of the wars that your country's launched. So now a lot of those people like don't live in the country anymore because you made it really unsafe for them by funding a bunch of crazy right-wing fascist armed groups, or by bombing them, or by funding a settler colonial entity like Israel that ethnically cleanses Palestinians. So there are just like so many repercussions. The fabric of society ends up shattered. And that's the situation that you have in Syria today. It's a situation that you have in Iraq today. It's a situation that you have in Lebanon. And I mean, you just go on and on. One country after Libya, Yemen. These are places that have been destroyed in unimaginable ways, to where like life goes on and people continue to live. I don't want to make it seem like apocalyptic,
No.
moonscape
But
or
those are well
something.
taken points on a range of different fronts. I mean, I'm glad you brought up the brain drain issue. Angela Merkel actually spoke directly to that a few years ago during a big wave of Syrian refugees coming to the country. And she was like, well, you guys are all mad at me, the anti-immigrant force in Germany, but really you don't understand, we're benefiting from this, because I forget the exact phrase she used, but it was something along the lines of all the middle-class professionals of these countries are now coming to Germany and like enriching the same professions in Germany, so that over time we are actually going to gain significantly in a number of different areas by these people coming here. And I thought, it was a bold statement in many ways, because on the one hand she was obviously trying to say that there's some value in the people who are coming, which I don't care what kind of job you do, there is value in human beings, and no human being's illegal. But on the other hand, she's basically just straight up saying, like, honestly, this is kind of rebounding in our favor. We're getting a bunch of cheap labor in the country. A lot of the people are highly skilled. They have no other option but to work for cheaper wages. And you see this all around the world. I read an amazing WikiLeaks cable in Ethiopia years and years ago, and the Ethiopian government was essentially complaining to the United States how the United States had an official policy of attempting to steal the doctors from Ethiopia. Like, they were going out of their way to recruit all the doctors in Ethiopia who were educated essentially for free and bring them to America, because of course major hospital systems can then employ them for less than quote unquote American doctors. And the whole thing, the whole brain drain aspect of these wars, I think is actually underrated in terms of how I think a lot of these governments think about this in the context of the repercussions when they're baking it in terms of their planning.
To just move on to because of what you just said, I have to now say this, is I just read an article today about how the US, because of COVID and just the horrible treatment of nurses, they have like a problem with, they don't have enough nurses in a lot of the country, because there's just like, people are drained, they're quitting, or they've been treated horribly by their employers, so they've left. And as a result, the US is going around the world basically trying to hand out visas in the developing world specifically to try to fill the gap, which you said, they can pay them less because they're not American, and you take a nurse away from a developing country that actually needs them more. So it's literally just going around the world, like looting necessary skilled workers who you didn't even have to educate.
Yeah.
Like, you're just taking them away. It's like, I mean, they do it with art and they do it with labor.
No, it's a good point. I mean, the U.S. policy is basically one big smash and grab raid in a lot of ways. Well, as always, that brings us to the end, Rania. I know a sad time for you and I, but nevertheless, we do have to end at some point. But do just want to remind people that, I mean, I guess we could go all night, but I'm not going to. But
we could, but then we'd pour one. He's going to be in the booth anyway, isn't he? He just stays there. What am I saying?
You can go to patreon.com/breakthrough news and become an ongoing donor, a patron, if you will. We would love to have you on board with us. That's patreon.com/breakthrough news. You can always catch all of our work at breakthroughnews.org, our website. We're at BT Newsroom across all your social media platforms. Plenty of great stuff coming, including a lot more from Rania Khalek from Cuba. There's good stuff coming. Che Guevara's daughter, Elena Guevara. You've interviewed many different people who invented vaccines, all sorts of interesting things that are coming very soon. So make sure you hit subscribe and hit that bell on YouTube as well. But for myself, for Rania, for the Breakthrough News team, that'll bring us to the end. But as always, we will see you next week.